he spent 40 years in silence. One song brought him back to life. He hadn't spoken a single word in 40 years. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. For most people, silence is temporary. It fills the gaps between sentences, settles in during moments of thought, and disappears when conversation returns. But for him, silence had become a way of life. It wasn't a pause. It was permanent. Neighbors would wave at him, and he would simply nod. Clerks at the grocery store tried small talk, but he would only point to the items he wanted. Over time, the people around him stopped expecting words. They accepted that he was different, though no one truly understood why. He lived in a small, modest house tucked away on the edge of town. The paint was chipped, the porch sagged slightly, but everything was neat and orderly. Inside, the walls were bare. No photographs, no decorations, no reminders of a past he refused to revisit. Every day followed the same pattern. He rose with the sun, made coffee in silence, and ate toast at the kitchen table while staring out the window. Sometimes he would sit there for an hour, lost in his own world, the ticking of the clock, the only sound in the room. When he left the house, his steps were measured. He worked small jobs, gardening, repairs, the kinds of things that required hands, not words. People valued him for his dependability, even if they never really knew him. They would say, "He's a quiet man," and leave it at that. But behind the silence was a storm. 40 years earlier, something had happened. Something so devastating that it had stolen his voice, not physically, but emotionally. It was easier to bury it all, easier to lock the door, and never let the memories out. Speaking meant remembering, and remembering meant pain. So he chose silence. People speculated. Some said he had taken a vow, though there was no evidence of that. Others whispered that he was hiding from something, or someone. Over time, the mystery faded. He simply became the man who never spoke. At church, he would sit in the back pew, head bowed, lips sealed during every hymn. At family gatherings, when he rarely attended, he would linger on the edges, smiling politely but never engaging. His relatives eventually stopped inviting him. It was too uncomfortable, trying to include someone who lived behind a wall of silence. Yet despite the absence of words, he wasn't unkind. If a neighbor's car wouldn't start, he would show up with his toolbox. If a child lost a ball in his yard, he would return it with a gentle smile. His silence wasn't cold. It was simply unbroken. Over the years, people grew used to his presence. He became part of the town's landscape, as familiar as the old clock tower or the worn cobblestone streets. He was always there, always silent, always steady. But no one ever stopped to ask what silence really cost him. They didn't see the nights when he sat alone in his darkened living room, staring at the empty chair across from him. They didn't hear the muffled sobs he sometimes failed to contain. They didn't know that every word he refused to speak weighed heavily inside him, a burden that grew heavier with every passing year. In silence, he grew older. His hair turned gray, his skin lined with age, but his silence remained untouched, preserved like a fragile relic from the past. 40 years is a long time to live without a voice. 40 years is long enough for the world to forget who you used to be. And yet, deep down, he knew one truth. Silence had saved him from breaking apart completely, but it had also kept him from truly living. What no one could have imagined was that after all those years, one unexpected moment, just a single song, would reach through the silence, crack it open, and pull him back into life. That moment was coming. For years, people had wondered how a man could live without speaking. But for him, it wasn't complicated. Silence became a routine, a shield that grew stronger with every day he chose not to break it. His life moved in predictable cycles. Each morning, he woke before the sun, made his coffee, and sat at the same wooden table he had owned for decades. He never replaced it, though the surface was scarred and worn. It was the kind of table that held history, the kind that remembered conversations even when no one else did. But in his house, there were no conversations left to remember. He filled his days with quiet work. Around town, people called him dependable. He was the man who could fix a leaking pipe or trim an overgrown hedge without complaint. They never heard him argue about prices. He would simply point, nod, and do the job. Payment was left in his hand or in an envelope, and he would walk away, wordless as always. Children in the neighborhood thought of him as a mystery. Some were afraid of him at first, whispering stories that he was cursed or that he had been punished by God. But eventually they grew used to him. They would ride their bikes past his house, waving as he sat on the porch in the evenings. He always waved back, his face softening into the smallest of smiles. Behind closed doors, however, his world was stripped bare. No music ever played on his radio. The television sat unplugged in the corner. He didn't want voices filling the house. He didn't want reminders of sound when his own voice remained trapped inside. The only noise was the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards when he walked across them. When he went to town, he stayed to himself. The diner waitress used to try, handing him a menu and asking how his day was going. But when he never answered, just tapped his order with a finger, she eventually stopped trying. Now she would simply place the plate in front of him and say, "Same as always," before moving on to the next customer. Even at the grocery store, people barely noticed him anymore. He moved through the aisles with his basket, buying the same few items: bread, milk, coffee, eggs. He always stood quietly in line, his eyes on the floor, waiting for the cashier to ring him up. Once, someone new asked if he needed help finding something. He just shook his head and walked away. After that, the employees learned not to ask. His silence was so complete that people forgot he had ever been anything else. They didn't know that decades earlier, he had been talkative, full of laughter, even known for singing along with the radio while he worked. That version of him had been erased, and no one around him knew it had ever existed. And yet, his silence didn't make him cruel. If a stranger stopped on the roadside with a flat tire, he would pull over and offer help. He never spoke, but his hands worked quickly, and when the job was done, he would give a nod before walking back to his truck. Gratitude was always spoken to him, but he never replied. It became almost normal. People thanked him. He gave silence in return. The years passed in that rhythm. Days turned to months, months turned to years, and he aged quietly. His silence became part of the town itself. People gave directions by his house. They told stories about the man who doesn't talk. But no one pressed for more. They had stopped wondering long ago. Inside himself, though, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Every time he saw a family laughing in the park, every time he heard someone singing on the radio in a passing car, he felt the ache of what he had lost. But instead of breaking the silence, he buried those feelings deeper. The truth was, he hadn't chosen silence because he liked it. He had chosen it because the alternative, speaking, remembering, reliving, was unbearable. What no one realized was that the silence wasn't permanent. It only seemed that way. Beneath the years of quiet, beneath the layers of grief, there was still a voice waiting for something strong enough to call it back. That something was closer than he could have ever expected. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret, but his silence was more than just a habit. It was a hiding place. Behind it lived a memory so painful that he had built his entire life around keeping it locked away. He had once been young, full of life, and not at all the man people saw now. He had laughed easily, talked freely, and filled rooms with his presence. Back then, music had been a constant in his world. Radios were always on, records spun in the evenings, and his voice often joined in, carrying familiar tunes. People who knew him then remembered him as someone who loved to sing. But that part of him had been buried the night everything changed. It had started with love. She was the kind of person who could make silence feel full. He didn't need music when she was near, though they listened to plenty together. She had a favorite song, one she played almost every day, humming along in a voice that made him smile without fail. It became their song, a soundtrack to their moments, stitched into the fabric of their lives. They had plans, simple ones but beautiful. A small house, a family, days filled with ordinary joys. He worked hard, she encouraged him, and together they felt unstoppable. For him, life had meaning in every corner because she was there. And then, in a single night, everything collapsed. The memory of it still haunted him. The sharp sound of screeching tires, the flashing lights of an ambulance, the endless hours at the hospital waiting for news that would never be good. By morning, she was gone. Just like that, the center of his world had vanished. When he walked out of that hospital, something inside him broke. Words no longer seemed possible. How could he speak when every thought led back to her? Every sentence carried her memory. Every sound felt like a reminder of what he had lost. The silence came naturally. It was easier not to speak at all than to risk saying her name and feeling the pain tear through him again. Friends tried to reach him in those early weeks. They visited, brought food, offered comfort, but he could not respond. He would sit, staring at the floor, unable to form the simplest reply. They thought time would heal him. But as days turned into months, and months into years, they saw that he was not coming back to who he had been. One by one, they drifted away, leaving him to his silence. The music stopped too. The records gathered dust. The radio went quiet. He couldn't bear to hear the song that had been theirs. Even ordinary tunes felt dangerous, each note threatening to open the wound he worked so hard to keep shut. The house that had once been full of sound became lifeless, and so did he. He built routines to survive. Work, chores, long walks that led nowhere. He avoided anything that reminded him of her. Certain streets, certain restaurants, even people who had known them both. He became smaller, not in body, but in spirit, a shadow of who he had once been. Years turned into decades, and the silence grew heavier. He no longer needed to force it. It became natural, almost comfortable. Speaking felt impossible now, like learning to walk after forgetting how. The world around him forgot his story, but inside, every day he remembered. Every day he lived with the weight of what had been taken from him. This was why he had never spoken again. Not because he couldn't, not because he didn't know how, but because words would always lead him back to that night, to the sound of a song that used to bring him joy, and to the silence that followed when she was gone. And so, he chose to bury himself in quiet. What he didn't know was that the world still had a way of finding him, that the very song he had been running from was still out there, waiting, and one day it would reach him again. When it did, everything he thought he had buried would return, and so would his voice. The years rolled on, and while the world changed around him, he remained the same. Technology moved forward at a pace he never bothered to follow. Music players became smaller, then vanished into phones. Neighbors streamed songs instead of spinning records. Children grew up with earbuds in their ears, while he lived in a house that hadn't known music in 4 decades. On his street, new families moved in and old ones moved away. People who had once whispered about the man who never spoke eventually passed on, and the new neighbors didn't even bother to ask. To them, he was simply a quiet man who kept to himself. Some thought he was mute. Others assumed he preferred solitude. Nobody guessed that his silence was the result of a wound that had never healed. When he walked through town, people barely noticed him. He was like part of the scenery, someone who was always there but never in the way. He walked slowly, his steps careful, his gaze lowered. Even his clothing stayed the same year after year. Simple work boots, worn jeans, and a faded jacket that had been patched more than once. He blended in so seamlessly that most people didn't give him a second glance. The routines that had carried him through the first years of grief became the structure of his entire life. Morning coffee, the same breakfast, the same path on his walks. Work was predictable too. Odd jobs for people who needed something fixed, a fence mended, or a roof patched. He didn't speak, but he always finished what he started. In a world full of constant change, his reliability was almost comforting to those who hired him. At church, he still sat in the same place every Sunday. The hymns washed over him, but he never sang. He bowed his head, folded his hands, and stayed silent while voices filled the room. Some who sat near him thought he was deeply reverent, maybe even more faithful than most. But the truth was simpler. Singing was impossible, because every note reminded him of what he had lost. The seasons changed, year after year. Winters came with their cold winds, and he would shovel the snow from his porch in silence. Spring brought flowers he never planted, blooming in yards he never visited. Summers echoed with the laughter of children in the streets, a sound that cut through him every time, but never drew a word from his lips. Autumn left the sidewalks scattered with leaves, and he would rake them quietly, watching as others prepared for holidays he no longer celebrated. He aged quietly, too. His hair turned gray, then white. His hands grew rougher, his back slightly more bent. But the silence did not change. It was untouched by time, as steady as ever. People who had known him only in his later years couldn't imagine him any other way. They couldn't picture him as a young man who once sang freely, or as someone who once had dreams of a family and a future. To them, he had always been silent, and always would be. The world carried on without him. Music festivals filled the parks in the summers. New technologies brought endless songs into people's pockets. Radios gave way to playlists, and strangers shared their favorite tracks online. But in his home, the air stayed still. The records sat untouched, the radio silent, the rooms echoing only with the sound of his footsteps. 40 years of quiet made him almost invisible. Yet behind the stillness, the memories never stopped pressing in. Every laugh he overheard, every note of music that slipped from a passing car, every moment of joy in others' lives reminded him of the life he once had and lost. To the world, he was simply the quiet man on the corner. But to himself, he was someone trapped between what had been and what could never be again. What he didn't know was that even after 40 years, the past was not finished with him. The silence he had built so carefully was waiting for one sound, one song, that would shatter it completely. It happened on an ordinary day, the kind of day he had lived through thousands of times before. He walked the same route through town, carrying a small bag of groceries, his head slightly bowed as always. The sun was warm on the pavement, and the air carried the usual sounds of life. Cars passing, children laughing, doors opening and closing. Nothing about that morning suggested that anything would be different. But it was. At the corner of Main Street, just outside the cafe, a young man sat on a stool with a guitar resting on his knee. Street performers were not unusual, but he rarely paid attention. He had trained himself not to listen. Music had always been too dangerous for him. Still, he slowed his pace slightly as the first notes floated into the air. The sound was gentle, not flashy or loud, just a steady rhythm that cut through the noise of the street. Something about it made him pause, though he didn't understand why. He told himself to keep walking, to ignore it the way he always did, but his feet betrayed him. Without meaning to, he stopped. The musician began to sing. The moment the first lyric carried into the air, his chest tightened. It was a voice unpolished but sincere, and the song it carried was not just any song. It was her song, the one she had played in their living room, the one she had hummed while washing dishes, the one that had become theirs long before tragedy had stolen her away. He froze. The world around him seemed to fade. The traffic, the voices of people passing, even the weight of the grocery bag in his hand. All he could hear was that melody. All he could feel was the sharp, sudden pull of memory dragging him back 40 years in an instant. The crowd didn't notice him. People were busy moving past, dropping coins into the open guitar case, chatting with one another as they walked. But inside him, the silence he had carried for decades began to tremble. The notes slipped through cracks he hadn't realized were still there, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt something breaking loose. He wanted to move, to turn and walk away before the song could finish, but his body wouldn't obey. He stood rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the musician. His heart pounded harder than it had in years, and memories he had buried so carefully came rushing back. He saw her face, smiling at him as the song played on the radio. He heard her laughter as she teased him for singing off-key. He felt the warmth of her hand resting on his. The song carried all of it, every moment of the life they had shared, every piece of what he had lost. Tears filled his eyes before he realized it. He blinked hard, but they slipped free anyway, sliding down his cheeks in front of strangers who had no idea what they were witnessing. To them, he was just another man on the sidewalk, listening to a street performer. But inside, he was unraveling. The young man with the guitar sang on, unaware of what his music had awakened. The words spilled out into the air, echoing across the street, carrying the weight of a memory that had been silent for too long. For 40 years, he had lived behind a wall of silence. But now, with every note, that wall was crumbling. The song was reaching into places he thought were sealed forever, stirring the part of him that had been locked away since the night she died. He clutched the grocery bag tighter, his knuckles white. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. Still, for the first time in decades, it felt like words were rising inside him, pressing to be spoken, desperate to escape. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning. The silence he had carried so long was about to break. All because of one song. The guitar played on, and the voice of the young man filled the street, but for him, it was no longer Main Street. It was 40 years ago, in a living room with lace curtains and a record spinning on the turntable. It was her humming as she folded laundry. It was the two of them slow dancing in the kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. The sound of the song wrapped around him like a storm. His chest tightened, his throat burned, and his eyes refused to look away. This wasn't just music. This was memory, sharp and merciless, breaking through the silence he had fought to protect for decades. He remembered the last time he had heard it. It was that night, the night everything ended. The radio had been playing softly as they drove, her fingers tapping against the dashboard in rhythm with the melody. Then came the screech of tires, the twisting metal, the shattering glass. The song had still been playing when the world went dark. It was the last sound she ever heard. For 40 years, he had avoided it. He had walked out of diners when it came on the jukebox, crossed the street to escape it playing from a car window, even destroyed the old record rather than risk hearing it again. But here it was, alive in the air, unavoidable. He was trapped in it, drowning in it. The young man singing had no idea. To him, it was just another song in his set list, something he strummed to catch the attention of passers-by. He couldn't know that with every word, he was reaching into a man's soul, pulling memories out like threads that had been knotted for too long. His body trembled. He gripped the grocery bag so tightly the paper tore at the edges, but he didn't move. His lips parted, as if his body wanted to sing with the words, but no sound came. His throat was raw from decades of silence, and the weight of grief pressed down, holding him still. Around him, life carried on. People walked past, tossing coins into the open guitar case. A couple laughed as they held hands. Children skipped along the sidewalk, their voices rising above the music. None of them noticed the man standing in the middle of it all, fighting a battle only he could feel. The song reached its chorus, the part she had always loved, the part she used to sing the loudest. The sound pierced him like a blade. His knees felt weak, and he swayed slightly where he stood. For a moment, he thought he might collapse. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, let them stain his weathered face. People glanced at him, curious, but quickly looked away. It wasn't unusual to see an old man crying on the street. What they couldn't know was that this was not just sorrow. This was something breaking loose. For the first time in 40 years, he wanted to speak. He wanted to sing. His lips moved, silently forming the words, though his voice was trapped beneath years of silence. The effort shook him. His body knew what his soul wanted, but the barrier was still too strong. And yet, something had shifted. The silence that had once felt unbreakable was cracking. He could feel it. The song had found the part of him that still lived, the part that had been buried, but not destroyed. As the final chord rang out and the young man's voice faded, he stood frozen in place, staring at the guitar player as though he were staring at a ghost. His breathing was heavy, his chest heaving with the force of emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. The silence inside him was no longer whole. It had been pierced, and there was no way to close it again. The song was finished, but for him, something was only beginning. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, the bag of groceries hanging limp in his hand, and it felt as though the ground beneath him had split open. The music was gone. The street noise had returned, but inside him the echoes of that song still rang, pulling him backward into a time he had fought to bury. Memories came in waves, sharper than he had expected. He saw her face the way it had been the first time he met her. Eyes bright, smile wide, a laugh that carried like sunlight. He remembered their walks through the park, her hand slipping into his, the warmth of her voice when she teased him about singing too loud. Every detail returned as though no years had passed at all. And then the darker memories followed. The hospital. The way the doctors avoided his eyes when they spoke. The stillness of her hand when he tried to hold it one last time. The silence that fell inside him the moment he realized she was gone. He had never said goodbye. Not out loud. He had walked away with the words trapped in his chest, and he had carried them, unspoken, for 40 years. The tears came harder now, and he didn't care who saw. His shoulders shook, his lips quivered. Passers-by looked quickly, and then away, unsettled but unwilling to intervene. To them, he was just another stranger, overcome by something they couldn't understand. But to him, it was a dam breaking. The song had torn open a door he had kept locked, and the weight of silence pressed against it, threatening to burst through. He felt the urge to speak. No, more than that. To sing. His lips formed the words he had memorized long ago, words he used to sing with her. For decades, they had lived inside him like ghosts, and now they were fighting to be free. But it was not just the song that returned to him. It was the love. It was the life he had lost. He remembered how she used to hum while cooking, how she insisted on dancing in the kitchen, even when there was no music playing. He remembered how she had leaned her head on his shoulder when that song played on the radio, how she had whispered, "This is ours." And he remembered the silence after, the unbearable quiet of the house when she was gone. How he sat in the living room with the record player, unable to press play because he knew what would happen if he did. The silence had seemed safer. Silence had been the only thing that kept him standing. But now, standing on that street, he realized what silence had stolen from him. It had taken not only his voice, but his life. He had locked himself away for 4 decades, never allowing himself to remember her fully, never allowing himself to grieve out loud. He had carried his pain like a stone in his chest, too heavy to lift, but too familiar to put down. And yet, here he was, his body trembling, his throat aching with the need to release what he had hidden. His lips moved again, barely forming the chorus of the song. No sound came out, but the attempt alone was enough to break him further. He could feel the words rising inside him, desperate, clawing to escape. The young man with the guitar glanced at him briefly, noticing his tears but playing on. He didn't know the story he had awakened. He didn't know he had stirred the silence of a man who had not spoken in 40 years. The man took a step closer, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the musician. His lips quivered, shaping words he had once sung so easily, and though his voice still failed him, the silence was cracking with every second. For the first time in 40 years, he wasn't just remembering. He was reaching. He was trying. And that meant something was changing. The silence that had once defined his life was no longer holding him prisoner. The song had reminded him of love, of loss, of everything he had tried to bury. And in that flood of memory, he realized the truth. He hadn't been living all these years. He had only been surviving. Now, with the song still echoing in his soul, survival wasn't enough. Something inside him was fighting to come back to life. His lips trembled as if they were learning how to move again. For so long, his mouth had only opened for the simplest of things: eating, yawning, breathing. But now, as the last notes of the song lingered in the air, it was as if his body remembered what it once meant to form words. His throat tightened, his chest heaved, and he felt something pushing up inside him, something he had kept buried for far too long. The young man with the guitar strummed the final chord and let it fade. A few people clapped softly. A couple tossed coins into his case. The crowd began to scatter, but the silent man remained. He stood frozen, eyes wet with tears, staring at the musician as though the world depended on him. And then it happened. A sound broke free. Just one word, quiet and hoarse, but real. His voice, his voice, after 40 years of silence. The first word startled even him. It came out uneven, like a whisper dragged across broken glass. But it was there. He had spoken. The young man looked up, confused. The crowd turned too. For decades, no one had heard him speak. And suddenly, here he was, lips moving, sound escaping. People stopped walking. The noise of the street seemed to dull as strangers realized they were witnessing something unusual. The man's chest heaved. He gripped the torn grocery bag with trembling hands. His lips moved again, forming the next word, this time louder, carrying with it the weight of everything he had lost. His voice cracked, but it didn't matter. He was speaking. And then, without planning it, without even meaning to, he began to sing. It was broken at first, a shaky thread of sound that wavered with every syllable. But once the first line left his lips, the rest followed, pulled out by years of silence, finally collapsing under the weight of memory. He sang the chorus, the very part she had always loved. His voice was raw, untrained after so many years, but it carried something more powerful than perfection. It carried pain, love, and release. The young man with the guitar stopped playing and just stared, eyes wide. The people around them fell into complete silence. Even the cars at the light seemed muted. All that existed in that moment was the voice of a man who had not spoken in 4 decades, finally breaking free. He stumbled through the lines, his throat catching on the words. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Each note carried her memory. Each word carried the goodbye he had never been able to say. For the first time since that night, he was not silent. He was alive in sound again. When his voice finally cracked and broke, leaving him breathless, the crowd did not move. They stood in stunned stillness, not sure what to do. And then, slowly, someone began to clap. Another followed. Within seconds, the sidewalk filled with applause. Not polite applause, but something deeper. People recognizing that they had just witnessed a moment of transformation. The young man with the guitar stepped closer, his voice soft. "Sing with me," he said, strumming the chords again. And this time, the older man didn't hesitate. His voice joined, still shaky, but stronger now. Carried not by skill, but by memory and longing. Together, they filled the street with the song that had once belonged to him and the woman he loved. People held their phones up, recording what they knew was something rare. Strangers wiped tears from their eyes. Children stared, wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but knowing they had seen something extraordinary. When the song ended, his voice gave out completely. He stood trembling, chest rising and falling, tears dripping onto the pavement. The crowd erupted in cheers, but he barely heard them. His eyes were locked on nothing, lost in a world of memory, of love, of release. For 40 years, he had lived in silence. And now, with one song, he had found his voice again. It was fragile, unsteady, but it was there. The wall had shattered, and he knew there was no going back. When the last notes faded and the crowd dispersed, he remained standing there, his chest still rising and falling as though he had just run a great distance. His throat ached, raw from the effort of forcing sound through it after so many years. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what had just happened. He had spoken. He had sung. After 40 years of silence, his voice had returned to him. The young man with the guitar gave him a look he would never forget, a look of quiet respect, as if he somehow understood without needing to know the details. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push. He simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that something extraordinary had taken place. The man tried to steady himself. He bent to pick up the torn grocery bag, but the eggs inside had cracked, the milk carton dented. It didn't matter. Nothing about that bag mattered anymore. He held it close, as if clutching proof that he was still standing, still alive. As he walked home, the world looked different. The same streets, the same storefronts, the same houses he had passed thousands of times before, but they no longer felt empty. He could still hear the song in his head, not as a burden now, but as a thread connecting him back to the life he had lost. For the first time in 4 decades, the silence inside him wasn't suffocating. It was breaking apart, letting air in, letting light in. When he reached his house, he set the groceries on the counter and stood in the middle of the kitchen. The chair across from him was still empty, just as it had been for 40 years. But for the first time, he didn't look at it with despair. He looked at it with memory. He saw her sitting there, humming that song, smiling at him. And instead of breaking him, the image filled him with warmth. Slowly, with shaking hands, he walked to the corner of the living room, where an old record player had sat untouched for decades. Dust covered it, a relic of a life he had abandoned. He brushed his fingers across it, then opened the cabinet where a stack of records still waited. Most were cracked, warped, or forgotten, but one remained intact. Their song. He placed it on the turntable. For a moment, he hesitated, afraid that pressing play would send him spiraling back into the grief he had carried so long. But then he remembered what had happened on Main Street, how the song had pulled words out of him when silence had seemed impossible. He lowered the needle. The record crackled, and then the music began. The same melody he had once feared, the same notes that had haunted him, filled the room again. He closed his eyes, and this time, instead of resisting, he sang. Softly at first, his voice fragile and uneven, but as the song played on, he grew louder, surer. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. He sang every word, every line, until his voice filled the house. Tears streamed down his face, but they weren't the tears of a man crushed by loss. They were the tears of someone who had finally allowed himself to grieve, finally allowed himself to remember, without hiding. For the first time, his silence was gone. When the record ended, he sat in the chair across from hers. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating silence he had lived with for 40 years. This was a peaceful quiet, one that carried music inside it, one that left room for memory and love. The next morning, when he walked to town, people noticed something different. His shoulders were not as heavy. His eyes carried light they hadn't seen before. And when the waitress at the diner asked, "The usual?" he looked up at her, and for the first time in 40 years, he answered. His voice was rough, broken, but clear enough. "Yes," he said. It was just one word, but it was enough. Enough to show that he was back. Enough to prove that the silence no longer owned him. 40 years he had lived without a voice, and in a single song, life had returned to him. Not the life he once had, but a new one. A life where silence no longer meant the end, but the beginning. A life where he could finally breathe again. The silence was over. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.